Alrighty, let's get started. Welcome back to Culture Binge, guys. This is the Wisecrack podcast where we explore what the hell is going on in the cultural zeitgeist. I'm your host, Michael Burns, joined as always by a woman who once told me that the only thing worth hoping for in all of life is a good nap. Serby. Serby, how are you today?
I'm well rested. How are you?
Oh, it's so good to hear. And this week we're joined by special guest, writer and philosopher, and however else he wants to be described, Tom Wyman. Tom, thank you so much for being here.
Hello.
So we're gonna get into a lot today. So we'll check in on our good friend the Delta variant, the thing that's currently ruining everyone's hot vax summer. And then, very excited, we're going to dive into Tom's new book, which is called Infinitely Full of Hope, talk about his work, and, maybe to have the big debate on whether everyone should have kids or not. And Tom's going to tell you once and for all today, so you can either, after listening to this, get a vasectomy or your tubes tied, or immediately start trying to procreate with the consenting partner of your choice. But first, as everyone knows, we're going to do our slaps and chaps. This is stuff we're liking this week and stuff we're kind of hating this week. Serby, you look like you're full of slap and chap energy. You want to get us started?
Sure. So what slaps is that I don't have COVID. It was just altitude sickness last week. Yes, I was thrilled. I got a test. It was negative, and it was just altitude sickness. I'm feeling a lot better now. What chaps is that I am just feeling a little down because it seems like COVID's back on the rise, and I was feeling so hopeful. So now it just sort of feels like wah, wah, wah.
Wow. So now the theme of today's episode is hopelessness. Tom, are you good with jumping in on this one? Do you have a slap and a chap?
Oh, my life's just one endless neutral grey. No, I mean, I think what slaps at the moment, well, my son, he's just turned 2. He started saying he's very into grapes, and he calls them bapes. That's very funny. So that's what I live for at the moment, to hear him ask me for bapes.
Thank you.
And what chaps? I've got to turn. Sorry.
Sorry, you can look at that in a second. I mean, interrupt. I just left that there as a little note.
Oh. What chaps? Let's see. Well, I mean, it's too hot. I don't like the summer. It's summer, and it's too hot. I'd like it to be. I think 10 degrees is warm enough. So I'd like it to. You're in LA, I'm sure.
I hate it here. You're in the right place to complain about summer heat. Summer is my least favorite season, and I think it's psychotic that people get excited about hot weather.
Yeah. I don't understand it.
Yeah. And when people are excited about it, and then as soon as it happens, they're like, "Oh, I can't sleep. I can't do anything." I mean, obviously, it's different in parts of the world, maybe where like you're prepared for hot weather, but everything in the UK is designed to be cold. It's designed to be about sort of a few degrees colder than it is now. Of course, everything is a bit outmoded, so it does get far too hot.
Yeah.
Even though when you look at the temperatures elsewhere in the world, you're like, Jesus Christ, I don't know if anyone ever cope. So yeah. Anyway, so I'm not cut out for that weather at all, and so I just feel like a flower.
But see, I do think one doesn't think of the UK as a super hot place, but some of the most miserably hot times of my life have been in the UK. Just because living in a place that has no built-in system for air. So you just open the windows and you hope for the best, and there's just this overwhelming warm, damp, enveloping blanket of death.
Well, if you're on a university campus, you're lucky if they haven't got the central heating on year round.
Yeah.
So on summer days, you're sat next to a radiator. God. Awful.
Well, this is officially an anti-summer podcast.
Yeah.
So, if we have any
people of Irish descent solidarity, I think, as well here.
Definitely. So, if we have any friends in Northern Europe or Patagonia that want to offer us a place to stay during the summer, please let us know. I'll do a quick slap and a chap. My slap will be very basic, a TV thing. I'm really enjoying the show, The White Lotus on HBO, a Mike White show. It's kind of about like the neurotic misery of rich people. But it's really interesting because I think the show isn't like this external critique of wealth in like a Succession type way. It's sort of just a deep dive into the emotional lives of a lot of messed up people who are oddly relatable and some of whom are trying to do good things. Extra points in the show that the angsty teenagers have been reading Freud, Nietzsche, Frantz Fanon, and one other scholar at this poolside resort. And it's just very funny to see like the random philosophy and psychoanalysis references in these teenagers' books. So that's fun. My chap, I guess this relates to last week's topic. I'm a bad person with no political solidarity, so I've been watching the Olympics. The most annoying thing about it, though, because at least for us, we're like 14 hours behind Tokyo. A lot of good stuff happens in the middle of the night. But rather than let you like watch it on a streaming service or app, NBC holds some of the things people want to watch the most to show on their primetime coverage, which takes place 18 hours after the events happen, which means if you want to watch it without knowing who won certain things, you can't look at the news all day. Because the newspaper, the New York Times in the morning will be like, this gymnast won this thing, but you can't fucking watch it for 12 hours. It's just very frustrating. And yeah, but I have been enjoying watching it. I think watching track and swimming are the best. I like sports where there's no judges and time is the only evaluator of victory. So there's no debate. He or she who is fastest wins.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I feel like my interest in the Olympics has decreased this time around because I keep seeing who won everything. So it just takes the joy out a little bit.
But my sneaky fun thing, I've watched late night diving a couple nights recently. Very fun, very scary. Don't know how.
Very scary.
Some great British divers as well. So I know that Tom has to be beaming with pride.
Yeah, sure. Why not? I've been paying attention to the Olympics as well. Why not?
Yeah.
Mostly what I see about the Olympics is people bitching about the athletes who beat them. Like, no one's ever good enough now to actually win anything. Like you know what I mean? Like, in the every now and then you just hear a story about like some athlete said, well, they shouldn't have won. They belong to the wrong organization, or like, they don't count as a woman for whatever stupid reason I've cooked up. It's just it's actually because it's not just about who's the fastest or anything like this. It's about who's the fastest according to the Olympics weird guidelines.
Yeah, of course.
Like, I mean, in the 800 meters have been like, or which is it 800 or 1500? Have been just designed specifically to keep Caster Semenya from winning.
Yeah.
It's just like, what's the point? I mean, if you're in that competition, like, what do you like? You get your gold medal and you're like, oh, I'm definitely the best. Because you're not.
Yeah. The IOC has very arbitrary standards for like, they basically like, their like testosterone level thing is nuts.
Yeah.
Obviously the same thing in the women's 100. Sha'Carri Richardson not being in it means that like, it's hard to say anyone really won that. She would have definitely medaled. So, okay, so they're bad now. But one thing is fun to watch. If anyone wants to watch the Olympics, watch the women's skateboarding. It's so much fun. I was watching Women's Park last night. Most of the competitors are 13, 14, 15-year-olds, just the coolest kids in the fucking world. And I made the comment to my partner last night that if we had a child and, she was a 13-year-old Olympic skateboarder, that I would have to get institutionalized because all I would do is cry with pride and I wouldn't be able to stop. And then her friends would be like, why is your dad in an institution? And she'd have to be like, because he cries when I do kickflips. So, but, Tom would know more about the pride of parenting. But let's get into, before we
win Olympic gold.
Same thing.
Yeah.
So before we let Tom teach us about why we should maybe be a little bit hopeful, let's talk about something that makes us all feel hopeless. Quick little first topic today is the Delta variant. And we talked about this last week a bit because, spoiler alert, I got it, as many people. in Los Angeles have recently. I actually got to go on CNN and talk about it too. So look up that clip if you want.
Did you really?
Yeah, I'll send it to you later, Survey. It's ridiculous. I was the poster boy for people who are vaccinated, who got it, who are quote unquote mad. And the CNN reporter tried to bait me into being like, unvaccinated people are trash. But I just like talked a lot about like historic inequality and how we test out drugs in this country and how some people have a right to be skeptical. And then I kind of ranted about how public health is really a communist issue. They cut all of that.
How did they even contact you?
A friend of a friend is a CNN producer. And I guess they were just like, we need to find someone that meets these standards. And then the CNN host didn't like me because when he started the interview, I kind of jokingly was like, this is about the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. And I was like, oh, cool. So you're trying to bait me into doing a culture war. And he did not find that funny at all. The cameraman did, though. Shouts to him. That guy ruled. But the Delta variant is a thing. And it's been a weird week, right? This, at least on this side of the pond, the CDC put out a report that was super scary. It said things like, this is more contagious than chickenpox. It can be just as transmittable by people who are already vaccinated. It showed that, the vaccines still work very well against the worst stuff like dying and hospitalization, but slightly less effective against catching it. There's also been the weird thing we talked about this last week, that the narrative for so long has been if a vaccinated person gets it, you just get like a bad cold for a few days. I don't know, as myself and like a lot of people in my immediate circle can attest, that's not true. I'm over 2 weeks in and still trying to get over my lingering cough. The one piece of maybe hope I saw this week was a New York Magazine piece written by David Wallace Wells, who's a good climate and science writer, interviewed some people who seem relatively smart. And there was one quote saying that they think in America will probably this will peak out in September. And that was based on modeling from Dr. Wyman's native UK, where I guess you technically live in the future, Tom, because you guys have already supposedly had your Delta variant wave. So out of curiosity, maybe I'll start with you. How has it felt over there? Because I feel like, didn't you all have your Freedom Day where Lord Boris said everything was good again, but at the same time rates were increasing, but now things are better. So what do things feel like from the future of COVID?
I mean, I think in the UK, there's sort of this a big contrast in attitudes between people who are obviously still terrified and are really worried about the sort of quite laissez-faire policies the government's pursuing in relation to the pandemic, and people who really just want to sack everything off. We're just not playing this anymore, we're not doing having a pandemic anymore. And it's just sort of if we just think that it's not happening, and maybe it won't. So the government tends to cater to those people more. And around the time of the Delta variant surge, obviously lots of people were getting the Delta variant. And there's this pingdemic, because we've got this centralized app here, which you're meant to use, the NHS app, where if your phone has been nearby the phone of someone who tests positive, then then it will tell you need to self-isolate, basically. And this has had a major disruptive effect on already hospitality. Everything is very understaffed. It's had a major effect. Lots of places have had to close, having only just opened up and that sort of thing. So we've got the government. We're very, very worried about that, because basically, effectively, we sort of had a sort of de facto lockdown for a couple of weeks, and that sort of led to the curve being flattened a little bit. And they're sort of they're now saying, or starting to say, if you double vax, you don't have to isolate and that sort of thing, which I'm not sure if there's a basis in science of that. It's just vibes. But that's how the UK government has always done this. It's just kind of they've just sort of seem to have imagined their voters and then gone, what will my average voter be bothered to do? And then just pitched all of the restrictions to that. And right now, what the average Conservative voter can be bothered to do is nothing to help prevent the virus from spreading, really. Maybe not coughing on people. That's it. And so, it's weird because obviously, like, you know, it's because the numbers are going down at the moment. I think they're still going down as of today.
Yeah.
Because they're going down, people aren't so worried about it, even though lots of people are getting and lots of people are in hospital. So it is this sort of weird thing where it's like, I mean, all the time our experience of the pandemic has been so mediated through what the media is saying about it, because all the messages coming out of the government are just totally laissez-faire now. All of the press are just like, it doesn't matter. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that's interesting to know there. We hope it keeps going down for you and your country's sake. Now, Serby, I'm curious about your perspective on this. I know that on my end, like a month ago, I was like going over to friends' houses a lot more liberally. I had even had my first night of like going to a bar, sitting inside with some friends. Got very excited. I was like, this feels like life. Had gone to the movies a couple times, blah, blah, blah. Now I'm back to just like, I don't know what I should be doing right now. I don't know what feels good. Serby, so how is like the rise of Delta, and you're, you know, also in Southern California, how has that affected like your attitude towards what you're doing? Have you shifted a lot? Have you not? Are you scared? Are you not? Like, how are you feeling about all this?
I'm not scared, but I have shifted. I mean, I wasn't like back in the open. I did travel for a wedding a couple weeks ago, but I was still very, very careful and things. And I think I'm feeling like back to not wanting to go to the grocery store, or maybe not wanting to see friends and things like that. So I don't know. I think I'm just back to being careful right now while there's not a lot of information out there. And then, you know, if it's not that bad, then I'll venture out a little bit again. But I'm still not comfortable like eating indoors or things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I do think the weirdest thing with all this, and I think in this country as well, you know, Tom talked right then about how, you know, the response and the messaging behind the government is more about what do voters want to hear than what is like scientific reality. And, you know, I think we've had maybe a lesser extent of that at the federal level. At the state level, we definitely have that, because we have a couple states like Texas and Florida in particular, where the governors have been like, yeah, things are getting really bad, but whatever, we're not enforcing any new restrictions. And recently, I guess like Biden yesterday or 2 days ago kind of called those governors out. But, you know, we're really seeing the problem with this whole constitutional system of states with their own governments in this country. And we are seeing a little bit too of like, I think we had this rush over here where the government wanted to use the 4th of July as this time to be like, freedom is real, America's open, it's all good. And then literally 3 weeks later, it was like, oh shit. So I think there's been that rush to do good political PR rather than communicate. And I do think that's sort of not at all to be like a truther or come off as anti-science, but I think one of the biggest things we've seen is just like a failure of science and public health communication. And even at the local level, the Los Angeles County Department of Health put out this graphic that was like, what happens if you're vaccinated? What happens if you're not vaccinated? And the graphic literally made it seem like if you're vaccinated, it's more dangerous, because they used weird colors. And the way they indicated safety was red X's. The way they indicated being unvaccinated is bad is green check marks. And a friend sent that to me, and I was like, what the fuck? Who in the public health office was like, you know what'll make people feel good? Red X's, which mark the healthy things. So I really hope after all,
really poor UX. Like
very poor.
What the fuck?
So I don't know. We'll check in on this. I just can't believe that I mean, I don't want to look back now, but we've, you know, intermittently checked in on this pandemic on this podcast for so long now. Hopefully it stops. We'll just say this again. If you live someplace where you can get vaccinated, be safe. If you live in a country where you can't yet, I'm sorry, that's likely the fault of America. The WHO just said they want us to not give people boosters so other people can get vaccines. I think that's a good idea. And know that Serby and I have no involvement in federal level policy of this country. And if we did, we'd be shipping you vaccines ourselves. Okay, so let's move on to maybe a more hopeful topic. But first, we want to give a quick shout out to this episode's sponsor, Upstart. Now, this does make me think of something that came up when I was reading Tom's book. There's one of the good things about it, we'll talk about this, is the weaving of personal narrative and with philosophical reflection. And Tom talks about in the book about what it's like to be a broke postgraduate student using your overdraft to pay rent. It reminded me of times in my life where I was afraid that a British bank was going to tell me that I couldn't use their money anymore to pay for life's necessities. And that's a scary feeling. And carrying debt is a scary feeling. And I'm sure that we've all had that at some point. Upstart is trying to help us make that final payment so we can get ahead. So Upstart is a fast and easy way to pay off debt with a personal loan all online. And whether it's paying off credit cards, high interest debt, funding personal expenses, over 500,000 people use Upstart to get one fixed monthly payment, because it's hard if you have a bunch of different debts you're trying to pay at once. I know that. I got a scary email from the student loan company today. Upstart knows that you're more than just your credit score and is expanding access to affordable credit. Unlike other lenders, Upstart considers your income and current employment to find you a smarter rate on your loan. With a 5-minute online rate check, you can see your rate up front for loans between $1,000 to $50,000. That's a lot. You can receive funds as fast as one business day after accepting your loan. So if this sounds of interest to you, you can find out how Upstart can lower your monthly payments today by going to upstart.com/wisecrack. That's upstart.com/wisecrack. Don't forget to use our URL to let them know we sent you. I can only assume they send us bags of free money if you use our link. So please do that. Loan amounts will be determined based on your credit, income, and certain other information provided in your loan application. So go to upstart.com/wisecrack, because debt sucks, but we're all going to live with it for the rest of our lives. Now that we've said that, let's get into it. We've referenced this before. Tom's here. We're going to talk about his book, Infinitely Full of Hope. To give a little bit of background, Tom, so you are, you're a writer, you're a philosopher, you did a whole ass PhD, so you're a real doctor and everything. You've taught at a few universities in the UK. Let me ask you this, because for a lot of people who, come out of the academic philosophy world, their goal is like, how can I write a very obscure technical book that will be published by a university press that 40 people in the world will buy. Hopefully some libraries will buy the copies that cost 113 pounds or whatever, and then I will be a success. You, on the other hand, have written a book that's written in language that's accessible to most people, that's published with a publisher that's making it readily available, and is at a price point where most people with some discretionary income can afford to actually read the book. And you've even promoted this book in non-academic places like the New York Times and like a cool food podcast, to name a couple. So how did this come about? How are you breaking all the rules of what a philosopher is supposed to write and writing a book that people might actually read?
Well, Michael, I have no intuitive grasp of social norms. So I don't really ever internalize anything that's expected of me. Okay. I've always been free to just do whatever I'm inclined to at any given point. I think it's just I obviously we've both sort of come from the same world in some respects. I've sort of I've done my PhD. I'd spent a couple of years sort of teaching precariously, I guess I could have written a sort of dry academic book in an attempt to impress other academics and get an academic job, but it just seemed like a sort of sunk cost. There's a sort of sunk cost fallacy involved there. And if you're just pouring water into the same potentially sinking ship. So I thought I'd put to switch from water to eggs, to put some of my eggs in a different basket, I suppose. And but also just write the book I wanted to write as I wanted to write it. I mean, I think that there's something a bit dishonest about most academic philosophy, because it always purports to be, especially when it's about kind of big questions of stuff, as opposed to little tiny micro issues that only appear in philosophy. But it's about sort of big question stuff. It's always purports to be sort of objective, kind of from nowhere, as if anyone rational would think the things a philosopher thinks. And that's not. I don't think that's true. I think I think ideas reflect the conditions under which they have come about and the conditions of the author's life in which they've come about. And writing a book like this was a way of making that clear, which is kind of more intellectually honest for me. And also, I mean, as you say, kind of people tell me it's relatable, and I believe them. It makes it more relatable to the general reader because, when there's a human being there, you can imagine people find that easier. It's like having a conversation.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, what good writing should be. It makes me think of, I saw a tweet from this writer, Siobhan Thompson, who writes on Rick and Morty now. And if I understand correctly, she's like a comedy writer out in LA, but used to be a British academic and has like a master's in anthropology from the University of Bristol or something. And she had a tweet that was just like, after being out of academia for a bit, looking back, most academic writing is so bad. And she was reflecting on like becoming someone who wanted to write for popular culture that people would actually read and unlearning those habits. And I think that's something refreshing about reading a book like this. Before we like dive into the book super heavy, one more preliminary question. But what do you think it means to like write a work of, and I hope this doesn't offend you that I say this, like popular philosophy? And by that I mean a book that uses philosophy to talk about stuff that a popular audience would like. I mean, what does that mean to you? Do you conceive of that in a different way than if you're trying to like write a convincing article about a paragraph from Adorno? Or for you, is it kind of like what you just said? You just like wrote what you wanted to write, and who gives a fuck? That's what you wanted to do.
Yeah, I tend to just write what I want to write. But I think like, there's obviously kind of so I think my academic articles perhaps aren't. I always get when I have written academic articles, I've always been criticized by reviewers for not being dry enough. I suppose for like kind of
not being dry enough.
Yeah. Not in as many words. There's kind of like, oh well, I liked the style, but I wasn't sure that it was appropriate. But I mean, in terms of popular philosophy itself, I think there's like there's lots of sort of hacky sort of pop philosophy out there where it's just like the philosophy and X phenomenon, or like the philosophy of X phenomenon. It's just some sort of book which treats everything a bit sort of. It takes some pop culture thing and it adds some kind of superficial philosophy in it. It just it doesn't really use it to illustrate anything deeper than well, you people like this thing, and it's a bit like this, I think popular philosophy is really good when it could even be in that kind of philosophy of X sort of format, actually, because obviously Wisecrack do lots of stuff like that, but it's when it kind of makes a sort of like it uses that stuff to kind of make a deeper point. So the philosophical ideas are in like genuine conversation with what's going on in the pop material, and indeed the pop culture stuff or whatever can inform the philosophy, right? Actually, this is one of my an academic article I currently have under review. Is essentially takes its cue from the line in The Simpsons where Homer says, "Weaseling out of things is important to learn. It's what separates us from the animals, except the weasel." And talking about the human-animal distinction, and how all philosophers actually, when they talk about the distinction of human and animals, make a version of the error Homer does, where you can separate us from all the animals except for like one that does it.
I wish I could be in the room with the reviewer when they get your article and read a Homer Simpson quote. Well, to maybe jump then into the topic of your book, right? So Infinitely Full of Hope, to reduce it to something really reductive, because it does a lot of things, is you talking about why you think it's cool to have kids, going through the process of you and your partner kind of navigating morally and ethically what it means to be parents in this world. I think this is important because, we did a video kind of recently at Wisecrack that talked about antinatalism and got into, what's the South African guy that hates kids?
David Benatar.
Yeah, Benatar. We talked about Edelman and some other figures. And for anyone listening who doesn't know what antinatalism is, it's this idea that, like, to be really reductive, that it's unethical to have kids, that like you shouldn't do it, whether that's because you're creating suffering or you're participating in some patriarchal heteronormative structure of power, or you're killing the planet by having kids. And in a lot of kind of like philosophical circles, leftist circles, edgy millennial circles, it's become a really common conversation about like, should we have kids? Is it bad? How could I do this morally? And I've been in settings with friends who have been like, I just don't know how anyone could have a kid right now, right? It's a thing that I think all of us have heard. So before we dive into that, Serby, I'm curious about this. Is this something you ever like think about, talk about? I think we've like chatted about it a little bit on the show before, but like, I don't know, in general, is that like a thing that comes up in your life talking to friends, and what sort of stuff do you hear in those conversations?
It does a lot. And I think, so just in a previous episode, I did mention that I wanted kids so much. Like I was like, when I grow up, I want to be a mom. That would be amazing.
When you grow up, because you're currently 15. I hope everyone knows that Serby is a really smart 15-year-old.
I'm a child. So when I would say in the last 6 months, though, I don't feel that way anymore. I feel a lot more cautious and concerned. And I think that maybe I don't want to have children. And it's not because I don't love kids or don't want to be a mom, but just I feel uncomfortable with the idea of having a child right now, or just bringing a child. And maybe I might adopt or something one day. But I do talk about this a lot with my friends, and I would say it's split 50-50. And my friends, meaning a lot of the female friends that I have. So half already have children, and the other half says they don't want kids for the same reasons. So I think it's interesting how much I've changed in 6 months. Maybe it's because of the pandemic, or because I'm not in a relationship or whatever. It's given me more time to think, or maybe just to question that it doesn't have to be the next logical step when you get older. It's not like a necessary phase in my life cycle. It could just be like, I don't have to have kids. So yeah, I feel like I lost my train of thought halfway through that answer, basically.
No, that's good. And I do think it's interesting, Serby, that you bring up the pandemic, because I have a few friends who have had children during the pandemic. I think in a similar timeline, I imagine, to Tom's son, because I have a few friends who have kids now that are like a year and a half, 2 years old, and they've reflected on how weird it's been to have the first year or two of their child's life be in that. I've heard some of them say the pro of it is that like they weren't commuting to jobs, so they were at home with their child, spending time with it. Some other friends I've heard say the weird thing has been they feel like their child is like under socialized, because there's been big gaps where the only humans the child has seen were like the parents. One of these kids actually went to its 1 year old birthday party, and it was one of the first kind of like post-vaccinated events, and this kid looked so scared of all the people. Remember, I kind of felt bad for him, because it was like, oh, you didn't know there was others. You thought there was just the two.
Oh, that's sad.
Yeah, no, but I think all that is relatable. So I guess then, Tom, and this is, just thinking about it from the book. So you're pretty clear in the book that like you and your partner always knew you wanted to have children. Something you thought would be fun, cool, good, inspiring, hopeful, all these things. So for you, like, did you start from a place of having your sort of like human brain that was like, yes, this is great, I want to create life with my partner, and a bit of that like thinky philosophy brain that was like, but is this technically a good thing? Or, I mean, did you exist in that space at all before you had your child?
I mean, actually, to be honest, if I'm really honest, I think that kind of like thinky philosophy space actually only really opened up in the same way, like once the child had been conceived and I saw my son on the scan, which so it came a bit too late, perhaps I wasn't thinking enough. In fact, I mean, before we did conceive a child, my worries were almost always just like practical kind of economic sort of worries, like could we ever afford to have a child, or would I actually be physically sort of able to look after a child, those sorts of worries. And then I saw my child on the scan. I was like, oh shit, this is a person, right? I do actually have duties. It isn't just something that we want. It's something I have duties to. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, I suppose in my defense, I think it's a lot easier to feel that you have duties to something that exists, as opposed to a merely hypothetical child you might not even have. So yeah, the so is that, yeah, that sort of covers that question, doesn't it? So yeah. So yeah, the thinking philosophy stuff only was unfortunately so in it, like, that this is a criticism people would, I think, in a certain sense, be right to raise of the book, which is that this is all kind of a sort of this is all sort of post facto justification for having children, because child. But I suppose to answer that thought, I would say, well, I mean, I still do have an argument that you can kind of challenge. So, you know, I hope it's a good argument. Obviously, it's an argument that I have constructed.
Well, so one of the aspects of the book, I'm curious, you know, here you talk about this, Tom, and here you think about this, Serby, is this idea that, to be really crass with it, and everyone should read the book, but the idea that we can hope, and part of what it means to have a child is that we can hope for a more collective we rather than an I, so that rather than only doing things because hopefully it makes my life better in having a child and helping it grow and be like a cool person and stuff, I'm participating in hope for a future. And to really quickly divert into like philosophy land, some of that argument reminded me of like a French philosopher, Alain Badiou, who is really into the idea of like, you know, collective subjects, so just groups of people that make something really cool happen. He calls that being immortal, because it means that while you're not going to live forever like a vampire, if you're a part of a cool artistic movement or a scientific development or a romance or politics or whatever, you're participating in a thing that's going to live on after you. So that's like a little bit of what I was getting from the book, that having children is a way to like participate in acts of hope for the future, even if that means it's not like our future.
Yeah.
Is that a fair interpretation of your work?
It's a great interpretation of my work. Yeah, I couldn't have put it better myself. I mean, hopefully, I might have put it better in the book, I don't know, but I couldn't put it better myself right now, because I did write most of the book before I had a toddler. But what I would say about, like, I think this is like the sort of one of the most important points to me is, and one of the most important kind of experiences I've had in sort of becoming a parent, and one of the reasons I'd recommend parenthood, is that once you have a sort of child, you don't really matter so much anymore. You know, your needs aren't really at the forefront of your life anymore, and that's sort of really liberating, I think, in the kind of society we have, where we're meant to, act in our own sort of like selfish interest over time. It's sort of wonderful to have a reason not to.
Wow. That's kind of beautiful. Serby, I know that you have to run soon, because for everyone that doesn't know, Serby has a really important job. We'll never tell you what it is. It might be the FBI, it might not be. But Serby has to run a little bit. Serby, I want to make sure you have time. I'm wondering if there's anything that you wanted to ask Tom or throw in as a grenade into the discussion before you have to skedaddle.
So what you're saying about having a child, and it sort of adds another variable into the world. This is just me paraphrasing or whatever, but you add another variable into the world, and then it could help the future. That's how I've always thought about when I wanted children, was I'm going to raise considerate, empathetic, strong children that will hopefully do something really, and whether that's on like a micro level with just helping individual people, or a macro level and maybe go into some sort of function that would be able to affect positive change on a greater scale. However, I wonder do you know like why I changed? Like, do you think it's anxiety? Do you think it's the pandemic? Like, because it was really just 6 months ago, I was like, no, like I can't do that. I still just can't have kids, even though I wanted to have them for all the same reasons that you've discussed on this podcast in your book. And then suddenly it was like, no, I can't do it. Like for me, I just can't do it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yes, obviously, like this, like, part of the idea is that, your kids might do things wonderful in the world, but I suppose, like, there's obviously kind of very real concerns about that might just be so totally irrational, but actually, your kids, for one thing, is human beings, right? So just like every other human being, right, they're going to be flawed in all sorts of ways, regardless of how good a parent you might happen to be. But also, like, there's a kind of, it feels almost a bit like you're kind of passing the buck, right? You're going, well, you guys have to do it, but you're the next generation will sort it out. We can't, we're too far gone, but we can, So, so I guess, like, what I would sort of emphasize in kind of response to that would be that in line with the stuff I've said about parenthood kind of like giving you a kind of reason not to act in your own selfish interest, raising children oughtn't to be something that you just do for your own kind of to sort of placate your ego, or to as an individual, as a parent, right? Raising children is something kind of like which also ought to be done on a social level. And once you have a child, I think this sort of becomes so obvious that we are not biologically meant to raise children in like two-parent families, right? Small children need vastly more attention than two human beings, no matter how dedicated you can possibly give them. And they need to see the world, to explore things, right? And this is what the pandemic, I think, has sort of really robbed children of, because it's sort of like legally, for public health reasons, kept children in these sort of like typically very closed, small household spaces, right? If you have just one child, and you're in a kind of cohabiting sort of couple raising them.
I want to make sure, I'm going to interrupt only to say, I think Survey has to go, so I want to make sure we give her a smooth out and allow her to say bye to her. And Survey, your job then is to, next episode, you're going to tell us if Thomas changed her mind and you now want a kid. So, Survey, we will catch you next time. Sorry that you have to run, but the FBI waits for no one.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, Thomas.
Sorry I didn't get to the end of my response.
No, that was good though. I want to ask you a couple more things.
So I'm now on the Serby screen, looking at just the side of my head is.
Your double screen. So everyone who's in the stream is loving this right now. Yeah. So that's so weird how one of them's different. So here's a question I have for you. I mean, I think that like an interesting thing about hope, you talk about this in the book, is I feel like sometimes it's caught between being conceived of as like a theological category in which hope becomes this fantastical thing, or like an aspect of messianic thought, where we're waiting for a savior or a messiah that's going to make things better. And that's why I like, the examples you give about politics in the book, I think work really well. As a Yank, I of course liked the Obama thing, because it was this reminder of this political moment where there was this narrative of hope. Everyone got really excited. And I even remember I was living in Scotland during the 2008 election, and I remember when Obama won, all of my like European friends were just like, yeah, they were like so hyped, and I was like, holy shit, being an American doesn't feel bad right now. People actually, my like German friends are like, hey, not so bad, and I was like, cool. But that we all know how that turned out, right? Because I think what we learned from that example, and I think we saw this with Corbyn a little bit, and then some other recent political figures, is we all secretly just want the Messiah to do it for us. So hope becomes a mechanism of, thank God, this person on TV is going to do the thing for me or whatnot. I think politically hope is really different. I think that's right. The Greta Thunberg example you bring up. When hope becomes political, it's about, okay, here's what we're hoping for, and that is orienting our praxis. We're going to do stuff to work towards this like hoped outcome. And I think you handled that really well in the book. Something I wonder about, though, with children and hopefulness is like how much, and hopefully this tracks, that distinction affects the way people approach children. I'll give this example. That, friends and family who are very, let's say, politically progressive, community oriented, think, and this is a big debate in the States is like sort of public schools versus private schools, state funding for education versus education that's based on who can afford the fanciest schools. And, you know, I've known people who are very progressive, left-leaning politically, but when they have a kid, all of a sudden, they make exceptions, right? So it's no longer about public school is important for my children. It's, well, public school is good in theory, but my Messiah needs to go to the most elite private school. And then there's actually, I heard a good podcast with MSNBC host Chris Hayes talking about this and being honest about like becoming a rich dude and that being in conflict with, you know, his personal politics. On the flip side, you know, I've known people and heard of people who, for them, having children has actually made them think more universally, because they start to think like not just about their family and their child, but whether it be the environment or a political system or education of the world around them. So I'm just wondering if this is something you've thought about, whether you thought about this speculatively or just experienced at the individual level, how having a child can create a new tension in what is important, and whether it's more of like this magical spiritual importance of the child or more of like a social political importance of the world the child lives in. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely say I would want to emphasize the social and political importance of the world the child lives in. I mean, you know, if nothing else, having a child who you love will it gives you something else as well. It's about sort of not acting into your own selfish interest, sort of thing. Gives you kind of an additional sort of stake in the world. But of course, as with everything, we need, and I talk about this towards the end of the book, you know, we need to navigate what that means in the same way that we need to navigate what pretty much every, you know, challenge we face in our life might mean. And you can see why people who, you know, believe in sort of education to be, you know, universal state fund or something, might end up sending their own children to private school, because state schools, as they actually exist, they might, you know, it might not be sort of functioning. And if you can save your child from an environment you feel isn't going to be good for them, then you know, of course, you can see why someone would do that. But you know, I suppose in those situations where what you sort of feel inclined to do as a parent come up against your political convictions, you know, the thing to do is to find some way of navigating it better, right? You know, in that sort of situation as described, doesn't really sound like either option is adequate as is.
Yeah.
So then you've got to think, well, what else can I do? I mean, how is there a way of being able to send my child, or being able to kind of fighting for a better state school system? I mean, obviously in reality, one of the reasons why state school systems fail is because richer parents take their kids out of school, and then politicians feel able to slash budgets. So obviously, you know, if you're kind of thinking about this at all, you know that you are part of the problem, as I'm sure this guy does.
Yeah, no, that's good. There's a question from the chat actually from someone who shares some commonalities with both of us, and that it's a former academic philosopher who left for the popular writing world. Philosopher and screenwriter Justin Boyd in the chat says this. He says, well, so much hope rhetoric covertly assumes that there is some solution out there, guaranteed somewhere, so that even if we aren't smart enough to figure it out, someone will. And then he says, and that's not true. So I wonder what you make of that, this idea that a lot of rhetoric around hope, and I think this does kind of relate to like the theological type of hope we were talking about. So what do you make of that? The idea that like hope rhetoric assumes that like even if we can't make the world better, some magical person in the future will, and whether or not that's a way to think about it, helpful to think about it, or just straight up not true. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, I think it's true insofar as hope as a concept only really emerges in conditions of uncertainty, right? So I mean, if you knew that someone was going to come along and solve it, then you wouldn't need to be hopeful, because you just have knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, the question then is, what do you do about uncertainty, right? How are you going to orient yourself towards it? I mean, in the book, this is part of my argument that I want to argue that you're not kind of properly hopeful if you kind of orient yourself passively towards that uncertainty, and you kind of just go, well, maybe something will happen, maybe it won't. If it's God's will or whatever, then something will happen. Someone will come and save it to me, or like you could say God in that situation. You could say kind of future generations of human beings. Oh, they'll find something sorting it out. Right? Who cares, right? I think what I want to argue is that the properly hopeful way to orient yourself within that uncertainty is to kind of find ways of actively bringing about better states of affairs, basically. And of course, when you're oriented towards that rationally, it might at some point come about where you just go, there's nothing I can do, right? There's nothing anyone can do. But again, the kind of the sort of right way of seeing that, to my mind, is to not go easily into despair. Right now, there is a tendency for people to go very easily into despair, because despair can be very comforting. Because if you're in total despair, or if you you act as if you are, you don't need to do anything, do you? So if you go, well, we're fucked, the world's going to end anyway, regardless of what I or anyone else does, we're doomed, then you can just live your life as you were, right? You don't have to change anything. But if you take seriously the possibility of doing something, of things being different, then you actually do have to do things that are different, regardless of whether or not you know they're going to work.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I like the way you used Kierkegaard in the book and talking about, his concept of despair. Because, of course, I think when it comes to both like despair and anxiety, Soren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, yada, 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 if you don't know who he is, Wikipedia. But yeah, I mean, gets at the debilitating aspects of despair. And I do think this isn't just like blowing smoke up your ass either. There's something slightly Kierkegaardian about your book, in that, Kierkegaard often in his writing, whether it's via his own voice or via these pseudonymous characters, lets us know how he's feeling about stuff. So when Kierkegaard writes about despair, he's writing from a position of despair, and you feel bad for the guy, like this sad Danish rich boy all alone drinking too much coffee and feeling bad. But of course, for Kierkegaard, there is this solution that looks like faith. You make the point in the book that, like, okay, but a lot of it for him boils down to, well, God, and you're like, well, I'm not looking for a theological solution. But that's why I've always thought like Kierkegaard is interesting structurally, because it's sort of like, well, there has to be a level of faith, commitment, hope that gets you out of that. And I do think that's why, like, there's an interesting commonality between, good Lutheran Kierkegaard and some sort of like 20th century post-Marxist thinkers like Badiou, who have a similar argument about like fidelity and hope and the kind of pull from the Christian tradition there. So, but I do, like, I don't know, I'm someone who kind of sees and struggles with that tension, right? Sometimes I think, yes, if we are oriented around some hope and there's some project there, the future is uncertain, but that doesn't mean that, to use the corny quote, that like a better world is impossible. Then there's a part of my brain sometimes that's like, are you just like using philosophy as a coping mechanism because the planet's literally dying and there's probably nothing we can do? And I definitely like oscillate between those two. I have those thoughts when I think about having children. And to be fair, because you're so vulnerable and honest in the book, like, I currently am not too far away from my partner and myself potentially trying to have kids. And it's just, yeah, it's a thing that's so hard to not go back and forth between this idea that, like, yes, hope is possible, a better world is possible. We have all these examples in history of people collectively doing amazing things. And on the other side, well, if there's no more water or air to breathe, no amount of good intellectual thinking is going to save you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, that's obviously a lot.
Yeah, sorry to throw that up. I'm just like throwing stuff at the wall, but yeah.
No, obviously, I think there are kind of open issues about faith and whether faith can be rational or sort of more or less rational, that sort of thing. Or whether it has to be bestowed by grace or whether you can choose to have it, that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, I suppose like, I've been using this argument when I've been talking about the book, which is that, well, so I mean, if you just have if you just have one child, right? Firstly, you've not, you're still below the replacement level of fertility. So in that sense, if you're worried about there being too many people, the human race is still, retracting, as it were.
Yeah.
Right. But secondly, God, you know how bad it's going to be if on top of there being, drought and everything, wildfires, if there's also a massive social care crisis because there's this cliff edge of aging population where no one, hardly anyone in the generations have children, and I mean, this is the sort of thing that I don't think any society, it's even roughly kind of organized as the way we have it now, would possibly be able to deal with. So that's a different apocalypse, right?
That's interesting. We'll kind of lean towards wrapping up. I could ask you questions about this for hours, but I know you have a life and a human life to take care of. So
I've got to help him with. I mean, it's 6, 7 here. I'm meant to keep him a bath.
Yeah. So I'll ask you one quick question. We'll wrap up. In reading this book, I had a question or this thought: Is Tom covertly arguing for a sort of humanism?
Yes.
So, okay, cool. Simple as that. That's great.
So, are you going to elaborate on that?
No, that's simple. I just wanted to know that. Yes is all I needed to hear there. I think that's how I was reading your book, and that's how I was reading the Kierkegaardian question you bring up early on. What do we replace this faith in God with? And I was like, a faith in humanity and the possibility of humanity. That's totally fine. Last question I'll ask you, we'll let you go, and I might just do the mailbag myself real quick because I want to do that. How do you see moving forward after this book? Have you thought at all about what you see your role, and it's going to sound pretentious, maybe, or pretentious assumption. What do you see the role of philosophy and a philosopher in this world, and especially doing that outside the hallowed halls of academia? What does that mean for you to keep doing philosophy?
Well, yeah, I think I can't remember the exact way he puts it, but Adorno, who comes up in the book quite a lot, puts it that the point of philosophy is to kind of is to try is aimed against Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein famously said, of what you cannot speak, we must remain silent. And Adorno said, well, that's exactly unphilosophical, because the point of philosophy is to try and say the things that we can't make sense of. That's what kind of, I suppose actually this relates to the question about popular philosophy. It's all kind of popular philosophy, or kind of properly applied philosophy does. Is it to my mind it takes these questions where these kind of confusions where people really don't seem to be able to talk about the thing they really need to be able to talk about, or to conceive the thing they really need to be able to conceive, and to be able to name it and to understand it. And must help us deal with it. And certainly in the age of climate change, what we're dealing with here is a phenomenon that we don't really understand. We're not all the evidence suggest, as far as I understand it, suggests that human intelligence evolved in order to help us deal with big cats, and to stop us from being killed by big cats. And human level intelligence is really good at identifying kind of concrete salient threats, and eliminating them. But climate change isn't really like that, because it's sort of everywhere and it's happening all the time and incrementally, and it's all these sort of weird different ways we don't expect. And we need to be able to think differently in order to be able to act transformatively. And so philosophy has a big role there. Which is why it's good, but nobody funds it.
Yeah, why would we fund that?
Exactly. Why would we fund that?
That's great. Well, truly, Tom, thank you so much for coming on. I do encourage everyone, get Tom's book, or if you're cheaper, you can't afford it, hold the book up.
It's white, so you can't really.
I like the cover a lot.
The cover. I'm really pleased with the cover.
Yeah, that's the hardest thing with philosophy books, is getting good covers. You got a good cover. But also, if you're not convinced yet, there's a great op-ed Tom has in the New York Times, which is some short excerpts from the book. I really enjoyed a lot of your writing at the outlet existed, but it's still It still is. It's still live. You can read that. So you can look at Tom's writing there. Also, if you're a Wisecrack fan, Tom's been writing videos for us. So if you haven't noticed that yet, go try to find which ones are his. He has one we're working on right now that I'm so excited about. It's going to be the first time we talk about I Think You Should Leave on Wisecrack, and I can't wait. Before I let you go, Tom, where can people find you on social media if they want to see your musings on Twitter or other platforms? Where do they do that?
Health Unto Death.
Health Unto Death, a play on Kierkegaard, friends.
Adorno.
Adorno's play on Kierkegaard. Yeah.
Adorno's pun on Kierkegaard. So you can tell that I just started my PhD when I came up with that handle.
You committed to it. So everyone go follow Tom at Health Unto Death. And Tom, hopefully you can come back sometime just to talk about other stuff with us. We will let you get going and take care of your child. So thank you so much for being here.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Later, Tom. So that was Tom, everyone. What we'll do real quick then, guys, is I'm just going to do a couple. We're here. You wrote a lot of great ones. A reminder, as always, if you want to get in touch with us, you can do that, and you should do that. And you can do that by hitting us up at, wait, let me remember the address. I forgot to put this in my notes. I'm very embarrassed right now. Maddie, if you're on the line, you can remind me. Is it culture@wisecrack.co? I think it is. I think that's how you get in touch with us. Here we go. I got it now. Culture Binge at wisecrack.co. Write us an email. Let us know what you think about Tom's discussion, his book, anything else we talked about, or call us at 213-534-8807. That's 213-534-8807, culturebinge at wisecrack.co. I'll just quickly go through a couple emails we have this time. So this is from Brian. This is about last week's episode. Brian says, I'm sorry to hear that you've been struggling with COVID. I hope this email finds you in much better health. Thank you. It really means a lot. Says, I'm writing a comment on your Olympic episode. I'm from Puerto Rico, and anytime an athlete competes representing our flag, it's a very big deal. As I'm writing this email, we just won our second gold medal in Olympic history. Jasmine Camacho Quinn, women's 100 hurdle. That race was awesome. Puerto Rico has a complex history with the U.S., and as of late on the island has become unbearable for your average Puerto Rican. I've had to say goodbye to many friends, family members who would have probably lived out their lives here had it not been for the ongoing economic, social, and political crisis. He says, I lose access to power and water at least twice a month due to the poor state of our infrastructure. Having an Olympic delegation gives us at least something to look forward to. Seeing them compete, even if they don't win, is a slap in a sea of chaps. Well put. Maybe there's a little bit of escapism in it too. P.S. I really enjoyed listening to Raymond on this episode, maybe considering him in the running for permanent host. Thank you. That's good to hear. Glad you liked Raymond. And I think, Brian, you didn't know this, but this obviously relates to this episode, talking about hopefulness in the way in which something as simple as Olympic athletes competing for a country that's going through a really bad time can symbolize hope. I think that's great. Zach also wrote in about the Olympics. Zach said, let me start by saying this channel is amazing. Thank you, Zach. Everything Wisecrack has created has propelled me on my philosophical journey. I think you're going to like this episode then, Zach. He says, so let's begin. In response to the question, should we have the Olympics? I might also answer questions like, should I listen to R. Kelly? Should I buy from Amazon? Should I take notes with a pen and paper? Should I use my MacBook Air Pro Nano 2.0 indestructible touchscreen? My answer may sound pessimistic with a hint of optimism. Morality is impossible. Follow me on this one. Everything you do or don't has moral implications in a negative way. The Olympics are harmful for all the ways you've discussed and more. R. Kelly is a monster and multiple people are attached to a single product. The fun and free music of Kesha is undercut by her abusive producer. A pen is made from plastic and paper, comes from deforestation, contrasted to everything Apple as a company does. The point I'm trying to articulate is that every action has an equal and horrific reaction. I guess that's a principle of physics. He goes on to say, but what if I didn't watch the Olympics, or I only took mental notes instead of storing my writing in the cloud or a hard drive? My answer is someone else will. It only takes one person to fuck it up for everyone else. I just want to be clear, he put asterisks in there. I just said fuck. I'm so sorry if you didn't want to swear and I made you. Have you heard the idea that a satellite can collide with another satellite and create an exponential amount of debris? Technically, it takes one. So basically, the gist here is that the world is kind of screwed. There is no morality under capitalism, so you might as well watch the Olympics. I think Zach has an interesting point there, and I do think that something we can be tempted towards, which is dangerous, is to make the stakes of our personal morality universal. And I know there's some people that'll be like, well, boycott watching the Olympics and it'll help, but it probably won't. Although the one point I disagree with him is I just can't listen to R. Kelly. It feels too gross. We'll just do one more email real quick. Thank you to everyone, as always, who wrote in and called. It means a lot to us. We read them all. We appreciate it. There is no Culture Binge without you. Letitia wrote this in. This is about the subject of taking time off from work. Letitia says,
On the subject of feeling guilty for taking time off, this video aired a week and a few days before my vacation was scheduled. Either that day or next week, our deli manager asked me if I wanted to skip my vacation because we're so short-handed. New hires never last. One department manager is out on injury, and the other just put in her 2 weeks, probably because she's sick of asking the grocery store manager to allow more people to work in our bakery deli. I really thought about it, but decided to take vacation as school starts soon, and this is my last chance to take 2 consecutive days off, probably for the rest of the year. I did agree to be available 2 days during my vacation, but my other coworker insisted I don't come in because they had it covered. That's great, Letitia. I'm glad that you stood up for yourself and took vacation there. It's so hard sometimes with jobs, right, to have this moral thing. But I'm a managing. Letitia tells us she works in a grocery, and unless it's a local grocery, it's probably owned by a multi-million-dollar company, and people that own it are making tons of money. So I think Letitia should not have to take the brunt of that. But that's the moral tension we talked about last time. So thank you for those emails. Once again, you can hit us up at culturebinge@wisecrack.co or 213-534-8807. Serby's not here to say this, but we can put her Twitter bio or Twitter username up on the screen. But you can check Serby out on Twitter if you haven't already. You can check me out at Michael O. Burns on Twitter and Instagram. Obviously, once again, thanks to Tom Wyman for being here. Check him out at Health Unto Death. Check out his book, Infinitely Full of Hope. And I shit you guys not. I stayed up last night and read it, finished it this morning. It's a really cool read. And I think if you're interested in philosophy, if you're interested in the ethics of having children, and even if you're interested in this idea of how can we hope for stuff in the world feels so shitty, I think it's great. It's not, I have arguments with some of it. It's not a perfect book. No book is a perfect book, but you should check it out. So we'll be back in 2 weeks. Thanks again for being here with us. Check out videos on Wisecrack. Look at the Patreon. Hit us up if you need to, and we will see you in the meantime. For Serby and Tom, this is Michael. We'll see you next time on Culture Binge.